Thanks very much, Jim, and particularly, I'd also like to acknowledge in the audience the Vice Chancellor of the University of Wollongong, Professor Paul Wellings, who's in the audience here. It's a pleasure to have you here all the way from Australia, Paul. And also, I'd like to particularly acknowledge and thank Dr. Steger for your leadership in bringing this together in what I think is a really important program and a superb program. And also, I wanted to thank you for your hospitality and also your warmth of welcome. I feel very much at home here in the United States. It doesn't take much for me to feel at home. I spent some formative years of my life here in early days, and it's lovely. It's lovely to be back. But the reason that we're sitting here this morning on the third meeting of the ISNGI is because we obviously share an interest in infrastructure, we share an interest in our communities, but we also share a passion for better stewardship of our future. And I think there is no doubt that one of the distinguishing features about infrastructure compared to so many other aspects of our modern and busy life is the fact that infrastructure lasts for so long, and it forces us to lift our eyes and our mental models to a much longer time horizon. And I think that's a very healthy outcome. Indeed, the United States and Australia and many other countries, to name just two, have had the extraordinary benefit given to them of their forefathers in terms of planning, investment and vision for the future. And the picture that I have there is one that will be well known to many in this room of the Hoover Dam and the shaping of the Colorado River that has given life to so much of the West Coast, and particularly to a megacity such as Los Angeles. And of course, the enormous logistical capabilities that arose from the building of the Burlington Rail Route from Chicago to San Francisco are two examples of foresight and vision and a clear ambition for nationhood. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are countless more examples of great foresight. In the case of Australia, with its Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is a great icon from an Australian perspective in terms of infrastructure. It connected a disjointed city and gave it the platform, some would argue, including myself, to be a great global city. And of course, another great infrastructure project that was a gift from our forefathers in Australia was the Snowy Mountains Hydro Scheme. And that was a very important initiative because of some of the very unique characteristics of the Australian electricity grid that runs along a very narrow strip of land on the east coast of Australia. Sorry, I'll just go back. Infrastructure shapes our society, and when done well, it will enable our potential to a great and at times unthinkably good future. While the nation-building task that was before our forefathers was immense, there's no relief in sight for ourselves or the next generation. We too must rise to the challenge of providing the best possible footing to ratchet up our long-term well-being and our prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, planning must enable a better future and not get in the way of it. There is no doubt in my mind that long-term planning is important, providing we can do so without producing inflexible, assumption-laden plans that cause inertia and indifference to our changing circumstances. When many of us travel, we find ourselves visiting the ruins of great past civilizations of, say, South America, Europe, and even Egypt. In fact, that's a picture of the Great Library in Alexandria from ancient Europe. And I'm sure that none of these civilizations ever intended that their homes and their civic monuments and the like would lie in ruin. They obviously built for the future, but something changed that disrupted their plans. And the ruins in many cases, not always, but in many cases, is a testimony to the failure to adapt to changing circumstances, to take on board new information and to act on it quickly enough. Infrastructure planning and the assets we build must produce services needed for people to thrive. It is not possible, I would argue, vigorously argue, to future-proof society. And to do it with bigger and stronger assets is the most ineffective and passive approach of all. However, an active approach to uncertainty of the future is for infrastructure and the governance systems of cities and regions to be more agile and flexible, to adjust and to flex to change. Regardless of its source of change, technology, the economy, climate, demographics, and shifting geopolitical forces all places a premium on timely and well-targeted interventions. Planning is the active process of navigating change, understanding its consequences and responding to it with both efficiency and efficacy. President Eisenhower summed this up superbly in this city when he said, in preparing for battle, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. We are constantly reminded that population growth will most likely result in about 9 billion people living on the planet in about 30 years. However, what is remarkable is the concentration of humanity in our cities may well intensify over this time, as alluded to by Dr. Steger. In that short period of time, some argue, like Karen Sito at Yale University, that global cities and their urban fringe will occupy an additional 1.2 million square kilometres, a tripling in size. That's an additional 1.35 billion people living in cities, suggesting that urban areas that currently occupy roughly 3% of the planet's surface will continue to expand. By comparison, urban areas increased by just 58,000 square kilometres in the past 30 years to the year 2000. More than half of the urban expansion will come from the massive scale urbanisation in India and China, a trend that has been growing in recent decades. And for example, the megaropolis, similar to the urban corridor between Boston and Washington, DC, this city, is likely to form between Hangzhou and Shenyang in China. But the fastest urbanisation is predicted to occur in newly developing regions in Africa, such as the coast of West Africa. As it stands, the world's cities bear responsibility for at least 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions. This is not surprising, given that they produce a disproportionate amount of both wealth and productivity. Of course, by highlighting this, I am not suggesting for a minute that humanity should abandon its mega city trends, as I suspect should it do so, it would further damage the environment and would even threaten social welfare. Edward Glacier said that cities are humanity's greatest creation. And while I have no contention with that statement, it should not serve as an excuse to take our cities for granted, where they are just simply used and abused. But yet haphazard expansion, poor governance, narrow and siloed government do not serve us well and are a drag on our cities' dynamic capabilities. Could it be, ladies and gentlemen, that cities prosper in spite of our governing arrangements rather than because of them? It appears to be a reasonable expectation that the vast majority of humanity will live in cities and together occupy not much more than about 4 to 5% of the planet's surface. That's roughly the same ratio as what a postage stamp is on an envelope. This has rightly resulted in calls for more investment in cities and to ensure their functionality and amenity. No argument there whatsoever. However, what is unreasonable is the perception and indeed the presumption that these cities are independent islands. While it is clear that they are both efficient and innovative, they certainly don't do it alone. There is an extreme interdependency of cities to their adjacent hinterlands for energy, water and waste management, to name just a few. And in the case of my own country, Australia, Australian cities have these dependencies which stretch well beyond the adjacent hinterland to the entire nation itself. So what I'm saying, which I know has been said before, is that cities have a responsibility to the wider geographic regions and the infrastructure systems that they rely upon for their existence. These critical interactions of people with infrastructure simply do not respect administrative boundaries. I am inspired, for example, by the ecosystem services strategy that originated in New York City, which has pioneered and championed these very principles in meeting New York City's daily 1.2 billion gallons of water it needs to operate. While building more water plants and other infrastructure is always an option for a city as wealthy as New York City, the ecosystem services folks decided otherwise. The moment of truth came when a proposal was put forward in the late 1980s to build more water treatment plants at a cost of about $4 billion in capital and an operating cost of about $200 million per annum. That's in the 80s. And the purpose of this investment was to deal with the increasingly poor quality of water resulting from increased nutrient-intensive farming that accelerated soil erosion and fears of pathogen contamination. Albert Appleton, the former director of New York Water, understood that charging New Yorkers almost double for their water in order to treat poor water quality because of avoidable bad practices upstream was a challenge that he was prepared to confront. And through a watershed management program that rewarded sustainable farming practices, had made dramatic improvements to water quality and has reduced the capital and the operating costs of providing water to New York City. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a great outcome and one that we should learn from around the world. Urban form matters, and there is a basic principle we all must understand, which is efficient infrastructure is not possible without efficient land use. A distinguishing feature of South America's favelas and the slums of India are the densely packed inhabitants. And more developed city areas often boast high land values, which then encourage tall buildings, are also densely packed with people and businesses. This encourages greater utilisation of all services, water, energy and transport, including encouraging both walking and the availability of mass transit. There is no easy answer to the question about how much density is right or even optimal for a community. However, what is clear is that neither the engineer, the biologist, the anthropologist, or even the economist, dare I say, can give an answer alone, or even collectively through some magical interdisciplinary approach. Whatever the technical perspective on density, it must be tempered with proper deliberation with the community about what they consider are the issues, the problems and considerations that they deem relevant in deciding urban form. But it is also true that when density is done well, this is how cities do more with less. And that's without mentioning the social and the business connections that drive innovation and wealth in cities. We all know that changing cities in terms of shape, functionality and amenity is a slow process. The reason it's slow is that the building stock is fixed for the short to the medium term, and to make change requires a long view, particularly on land use. Without it, the risks of haphazard growth are high, along with lock-in to an inefficient and inappropriate living conditions for a long period of time. I don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that cities were ever intended to be bastions of efficiency, lower carbon footprints and environmental stewardship. But in many ways, they have done just that. However, cities have more than fulfilled their original purpose, which was a place to do business, create wealth, and drive innovation. The question for practitioners and scholars alike is, do we have the higher mental model, the higher technical and business model to help us understand the long-term consequences of decisions on the performance and well-being of our cities? This lack of a higher mental model applies equally to cities when it comes to the relationship between city performance and infrastructure that is required. There is an absence of incentive, for example, to improve existing infrastructure compared with building new assets. This is costing taxpayers around the globe a great deal in poor value for money. It adds risk for private investors and diminishing benefit for each dollar expended for the community. An area that continues to be drifting and gone astray to some extent, and this is not being helped by proponents of big data and other members of the technical modelling community who purport that the future is more predictable by virtue of the enormous computational capacity we now have at our disposal. While the potential benefits of using data and computation is incredibly important to understanding new perspectives on relationship and change, I think it is still a safe guess that the future will always surprise. If that is the case, then the most important infrastructure initiative in infrastructure provision and management of our cities concerns striking a better balance between the predictability of events in the system and the flexibility of the system to respond. Given cities are just so complex and difficult to predict, there is an urgency to do much more in terms of removing the impediments to agile and flexible decision-making. Australian cities, and perhaps US ones are similarly affected, are affected by a plethora of rules and regulations from land use through to traffic management that prevent flexible and agile responses to emerging events. However, I do believe, and some of you may disagree with me, that the US has good pedigree in this adaptation space. For example, as mentioned earlier, the Great Western Railway, the Burlington route connecting Chicago and San Francisco, bestowed a gift of better logistics to a fledgling federation. But the more important legacy beyond the steam engines and the railway lines was something far more profound. The new railway owners had a problem. Every town and train passed through would set their clocks to the rising and the setting of the sun. In the absence of a national standard time, it was impossible to write a timetable for a new east-west passage. Sir Stamford Fleming divided the continent into 4 different time zones, east to west, so every 15 degrees of longitude equaled 1 hour of difference. Fleming's time zones solved a very practical problem. National timetables could be written for the great east-west train journey from Chicago to San Francisco. The new railroads demanded legislative change to create time zones that enabled the full benefit of the new technology to operate with efficiency and enabled the US to operate as a single coherent economy for the first time. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, the rest is modern history. And the US has kept its form with almost 10 states now, as I understand it, that have put in place enabling legislation for the testing of driverless cars on their public road network. I think this is a very important development and one that is equally as profound as the standardised time. Because infrastructure is the medium for almost everything we do in modern life, adapting the rules and the regulations to enable more innovation is one down payment we can make in preventing the landmarks of our achievements from being the next generation of ruins for our children's children to visit. We just need to get out of the way and let people innovate. In doing so, we have a responsibility to leverage the new infrastructure of data and computational capacity that we now have available in an abundance. Its potential to an unthinkably good future is the same as it was for the Burlington route. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Chris Barrett, who understands so much that computation can do towards making us wiser, providing we choose to use it wisely. Please welcome Professor Chris Barrett.